Welcome to the School of Imperfection. I'm your host, Mikey Cristal. John Stuart Reid is sitting in a place that I have been interested in for many, many years, which I tend to call the science of spirituality. Before you roll your eyes, if you were going to, maybe you weren't, I'm interested in this place where spiritual woo-woo things tend to have scientific grounds, and or science catches up and says, hey, that works. I had carpal tunnel back in the day. I got it from landscaping. I was digging too many holes and pulling too many tarps, and my hands were hurting all the time. And I went to the doctor, and he said, yeah, you have carpal tunnel. He learned that after jamming electrodes into my flesh, sending electric signals through them, which was awesome. And I said, cool, what do I do about that? And he said, nothing. You can get surgery to carve open a little hole in the bone that your tendons are running through. That'll make your hands hurt less. It's pretty painful. Or you can wear braces on your hands. And neither seemed like good options. And it wasn't debilitating, but I was in sort of general discomfort. And then I tried acupuncture, and that cured it. This was 20 years ago, by the way. Now we could say it was psychosomatic, who knows? But I can tell you that 5 or 6 or 7 acupuncture sessions, which were painful because they were jamming them needles in my hands, thumbs, wasn't fun, but it did work. And so that shifted a perspective for me that stayed in the back of my mind. Well, if acupuncture works, well, then what is all of this hullabaloo about contemporary science thinking these things aren't real? And maybe it's caught up even more. So I'm always on the lookout for things that merge these worlds. And so John Stuart Reid is a pioneer acoustics researcher, scientist, and inventor doing work in cymatics. And what he's studying is the science of sound vibrations and sound healing, for lack of a better term. Maybe you've been to one of those sound healing sessions that are very relaxing, but perhaps in the back of your mind, you're like, this isn't doing shit. Well, it turns out it is. And John Stuart Reid is studying that under a microscope to see what is happening when these sound vibrations hit your body. And is it really promoting healing? Spoiler alert, it is, according to his science. And so check it out. There's some really interesting stuff. You have 50 years of acoustics engineering background, and at a certain point you had experience in the pyramids of Giza that shifted your path a little bit. Do you want to maybe give us a kind of a play-by-play?
Sure, right. Yeah, well, my career began as an acoustics engineer. So I actually founded my own acoustics engineering company when I was a young man, and I ran it for 30 straight years. And it was very successful, not a huge business like £1 million or $1 million or whatever, that kind of size. But just a couple of years before I sold that business, an event occurred in my life, as you mentioned, in the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which actually caused me to sell my business. And not only that, but also to change career paths entirely. And what happened was my daddy and I had traveled in Egypt many times, but on this particular occasion, we found ourselves in the Great Pyramid, in the King's Chamber, which has an astonishing acoustic, and we were there alone. This didn't happen because we'd planned it. It was just pure chance. But on previous occasions, we had been in there, and we'd been in with a lot of other tourists making noise. And it's a little bit like, I can liken it, if for those listeners, viewers who have not actually experienced this themselves in the Great Pyramid of Egypt, I can liken it to going into a church, a mosque, a synagogue, some sacred space of a religious nature anyway, that where you expect silence, you expect reverence, and when you have a gaggle of tourists making a lot of noise, of course, you just can't achieve that. You can't sense the spirit of the place. But in this case, because we were all alone, it was a really wonderful experience. And one of the things that I'd always wanted to do, was to lie in the sarcophagus. This is basically like a coffin, you could say, of granite. It was obviously originally a block of granite that had been hollowed out. A lot of people think that the pharaoh, certainly mainstream Egyptology, think that the pharaoh Khufu was at one time interred in that coffin, in that sarcophagus. Many other people take a completely different view, that it was never intended to be a place of interment. Anyway, regardless of that argument, I had always wanted to lie in it. Why? Because as an acoustics engineer at that time, I was fascinated by the acoustics in the chamber as a whole, but also this sarcophagus is highly resonant. What I mean by that is if you strike the side of it with your fist, for example, any of the sides, it rings like a low-pitched bell. And it has a beautiful sound. It's not a single frequency that it creates. It's a kind of an array of frequencies, very beautiful, very low pitched, but nevertheless very beautiful. Anyway, so I was interested in the resonant properties. And so I knew that if I lay in it and made a vocal glissando, that at one particular vocal pitch, there would be a prime resonant frequency, a frequency at which the sarcophagus really became excited because of my vocal energy. I knew that in advance, obviously, but, doing it's another thing. And so anyway, I took this opportunity to lie in it. My daddy just stood there very quietly and watching and listening. And certainly this is exactly what happened at one particular vocal pitch that I later discovered was 117 hertz. It's a B, very close to a B flat. Every cell in my body seemed to tingle, did tingle, and goosebumps broke out all over my flesh. It was an amazing experience, and it was a kind of, I don't just call it a wave of acoustic energy that was washing up and down my spine. And at that point in my career, as I mentioned earlier, I had been an acoustics engineer for almost 30 years. Never experienced anything close to that in all of the experiences that I've had. And so I knew that this was something very special, and it seemed to suggest to me design. I thought that this is probably not happenstance. This is suggesting design. And so what I wanted to do was basically to go back to the pyramid armed with a lot of acoustics instrumentation. So cutting this story very short, I did exactly that. The next year, I gained permission to go back, and I carried out a series of what any acoustics engineer would consider to be standard acoustics tests. They were all very successful. And one in particular was an amazing experience because the whole sarcophagus began to beat like a beating heart. These were beat frequencies for those of you who know what they are. But these were very powerful beats, just like a heart beating. And the antiquities inspector who was with me on that occasion, he thought I was going to damage the sarcophagus. He kind of rushed over to me. What do you do? What do you do? Anyway, of course, it wasn't going to damage the sarcophagus. These were just purely powerful beat frequencies. But anyway, there's a whole story related to that, to what these frequencies mean, what these beats mean in relation to the rebirth symbolism of the pyramid. What I really wanted to share with you all is the 97 experiments, because the one particular experiment I couldn't conduct that year in 96 was a cymatics experiment. For those of you who don't know that word or what that means, it's basically the science of visible sound. So all the sounds around us are obviously impinging on all the surfaces around us, including our own body, all of the time. And whenever that occurs, there will always be an imprint, a geometric imprint of those sound frequencies on the membranes, on the surfaces around us. This even goes right down into the cellular level. So even on the surface membrane of every cell in our body, obviously they have membranes, right? Then there's a cymatic pattern. And usually these patterns are very geometric in form. So this is the interplay between sound and membranes, essentially. And you might be thinking, well, what about hard surfaces? Well, even hard surfaces. I mean, Ernst Chladni, who pretty much kickstarted this science around about 1800, he was making visible sound on a metal plate. And you might think, well, how can sound make a metal plate vibrate in complex ways? Well, it does, it really does. So if any of you want to look up Ernst Chladni, you'll find Chladni patterns. And these are kind of the precursor, ultimately, to the science of cymatics that we have today. Anyway, so getting back to this concept of sound impinging or imprinting onto membranes all around us. But what I was interested to do was to stretch a membrane, PVC membrane, across the open top of the sarcophagus and then tension it with little bags of sand all around the perimeter to give it an even tension, and then sprinkle sand on the membrane. Now, instead of me lying in the sarcophagus to make sound, now we would put a small speaker there and then make sound from an electronic oscillator, right? That's exactly the essence of the experiment. Well, I backtrack a little bit. 3 weeks before going out to Egypt, something happened. It turned out to be a great gift, but at the time, it was anything but. It was an injury to my lower back, quite a serious injury. I obviously did something very silly. I bent down at an angle, lifted something up. I think it was a toolbox. And oh my goodness, the pain was excruciating. Basically, it was a muscle tear. Well, what happens in your body, in your spine, when you injure it in that way is a spasm. Basically, it's in medical terms, it's sometimes called a splinting cycle rather. You know, like how when you break a bone or something, you want to put a splint in there to keep it straight. Well, in this case, the body makes its own splint in the form of a spasm of the muscles. All the muscles in that area that are not damaged, they all gather together and splint this area. And the splint itself causes way more pain than even the injury, right? So it's an extremely painful condition when you have a back injury like that. And it can take many, many weeks, even months sometimes, to heal. In this case, this was only 3 weeks before going out to Egypt, and I'd paid them a lot of money to conduct these experiments. You know, they don't let you do this for free. And so, again, cutting it very short, I just basically took a kind of more painkillers, an overdose, you could say, of painkillers to try and numb the pain to the degree that I could at least function as a human being. So I had to crawl into the pyramid literally on my hands and knees in great pain. Other people carried in all of the equipment. And somehow, with the help of the antiquities inspector, we set up this experiment in 1997 to make visible the resonances in that sarcophagus. Well, what happened was absolutely extraordinary. About 20 minutes into this experiment, we were just starting to make visible, like sprinkle the sand on, turn on the oscillator, and make some sound. Well, the first thing that happened was, the first image that appeared on the membrane was an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph. You know, I had been expecting a geometric pattern. In fact, I thought, obviously, what we will see is a series of geometric patterns. And then later, you know, back in my lab, I will analyze them to learn more about the resonances in this granite box. And by the way, the granite itself from Aswan is about 20% quartz crystal. So this is the reason why it is so resonant, because it has a very high percentage of quartz in it. Anyway, but to see an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, never in my wildest dreams had I thought that something like that would occur.
Are we saying like it kind of resembled a hieroglyph, or like?
I have to say that, obviously, but you know, initially when I first saw it, I recognized it immediately as a hieroglyph. I knew what the form was. And the form, it's called the Djed, the D-J-E-D, the Djed pillar. And it's basically the backbone of the god Osiris in hieroglyphic terms, in the symbolism of ancient Egypt. And so at this point, the antiquities inspector, who had helped me to set it up, but then he went away and he was still in the chamber, but he was standing up against the north wall, filing his nails, actually, and looking rather bored and probably thinking this Englishman is a little bit, you know, not quite right in the head to be doing this and paying all his money. But anyway, that's the kind of look he had on his face. But now when he saw what I was seeing, this hieroglyph, and it wasn't static, by the way, it was snaking, it was writhing. It was an amazing thing to watch. And so now he rushed across the chamber and he said, "How you do that? How you do that?" And he got very excited. And now he wanted to help with the experiment. And so we became a little team. And every time he was actually scraping the sand off and sprinkling fresh sand on while I was doing other things. And every time, or almost every time, we changed the frequency that was, driving into the sarcophagus, a new hieroglyph would appear, different hieroglyph this time, and then another. In between these hieroglyphs, by the way, there were some very strange, otherworldly kind of shapes. But every now and again, there would be this hieroglyph, another hieroglyph would appear, and many of them were very familiar to me and to him. Yes, I mean, obviously, we still have to say resemble hieroglyphs,
Yeah.
but if there'd only been one, we could definitely say that for sure, but there were multiple hieroglyphs. And so I don't really think it's fair or reasonable to say that these resemble hieroglyphs. They are hieroglyphs. So and I do have a whole hypothesis as to how that could have occurred, which we could talk about either this time or in another podcast. But then about 20 minutes into this experiment, I suddenly realized that there was no pain in my lower back. The pain had all completely vanished. And this was a consequence of the sound that I was making in the sarcophagus. So this really got my attention. 3 weeks of severe pain, 3 weeks of taking painkillers, analgesics, popping them like M&Ms. I'd even been to a physiotherapist a couple of times, but nothing had touched that pain. And yet 20 minutes of sound, mainly low-frequency sound, I have to say, and the pain was banished. And what I thought in that moment, when I first recognized, because I'd been very focused, obviously, on what I was doing, but when I suddenly realized that there was no pain, the thought that flashed across my mind at that point was, I know what this is. I'm very excited, seeing these hieroglyphs, like who wouldn't be? And so I'm excited, and obviously there'll be endorphins flowing in my bloodstream, masking the pain, doing a really good job of masking the pain, because there was none. And I thought, when I get back outside the pyramid, back to the hotel and so on, the pain will come back. But the pain never did come back. So a real healing had occurred, and I was obviously very excited about that, because I suddenly realized that here was potentially a new tool for medical science. And then the other aspect to this whole experiment was potentially a new tool for science in the cymatics arena. The fact that making sound visible in this way, if we can make hieroglyphs visible from, thousands of years ago, what else can we do with this scientific tool? And so that was basically the life-changing event in my life in 97. 2 years later, I sold the business. It took 2 years to sell it. I was immediately, I've got to change my career. I'd always wanted to be a scientist, but, we have to earn a living. The way that my father actually had suggested to me, when I was a young man, that engineering was probably the best way, not only to enjoy my career, but also because I was obviously very interested in engineering and electronics in general. But also, we have to earn a living, So that was the direction that I went in. But here I was, all 30 years later almost, and wanting to change my career to that of a scientist for two reasons, really. The first was to investigate the biological mechanisms that had underpinned that amazing kind of, seemingly miraculous healing of my lower back. And then the other thing was to develop a new type of scientific instrument. And you see it right behind me here now. This is the Cymascope instrument, C-Y-M-A, scope, like microscope. And it's a wonderful instrument. And we don't make sound visible with sand or particulate matter anymore. It's all now made visible with pure water, and the purer the better for reproducibility. So now the surface membrane is the surface tension of water, where you imprint sound onto it. And of course, you're effectively making the sound visible. And some people have said to me, well, we've always been able to make sound visible, in the modern era with spectrographics and so on. Yes, but that is graphs. They are graphs. That's an XY graph, right, of the energy of a sound, right? It's not how we would see that sound. If we could see sound with our eyes, we wouldn't see graphs. nature doesn't use graphs. We would see an analog form. And this is an aspect of sound that a lot of people get confused about and don't really understand. And one of the reasons is because of the terminology that scientists typically and engineers use to describe sound. They talk about sound waves. But the reality is that sound waves don't exist. The term wave or the word wave comes from this graphic XY looking at the periodicities within the sound. In other words, the energy as it oscillates within the sound. When you graph it, of course it looks like a wave. But the reality is that all the sounds that we've ever heard as humans have been spherical in their space form. So what's literally emerging from my mouth now is a sound bubble. And that bubble has a beautiful pattern on its surface. And of course, it's not just going forward. It's not just propagating forward from my mouth. As soon as it leaves my mouth, it diffracts backwards. So it's now literally surrounding my whole head and then obviously expanding away at the speed of sound, right? So this idea of the Cymascope, what we actually are doing is we are seeing a cross-section through that sound bubble, allowing us to see the interior, and it is an analog form of energy. And it's wonderful. We now have them in universities and private research institutions in various parts of the world, and getting really wonderful results with it. This is a style of instrument, scientific instrument, that's never been invented before. It's never been, thought of before. So I'm very proud to have been the person who brought this into the world, who birthed it into the world. And also, all those years since 1997, I have been studying very deeply the biological mechanisms, how sound actually stimulates, catalyzes the body's healing response. And so it's a wonderful future that lies ahead in mainstream medicine. I believe it's already started to happen, and I believe that snowball will continue to grow, and eventually it will become a very important part of mainstream medicine. Vibrational medicine is the kind of umbrella term for this. So sound frequencies, music, of course, which is obviously sound frequencies, but in a different form. And even light frequencies, which now have the very scientific sounding term photobiomodulation, which is now being used actually in dermatology departments of hospitals all over the world. And ultrasound, you probably know, is also now in use in hospitals all over the world, not just diagnostic ultrasound, but therapeutic ultrasound. And so it's not much of a stretch, to understand that we can go from ultrasound, which is very, very high frequency sound, into more audible ranges of sound. And they are, in fact, extremely therapeutic. And that's why my back was healed when I now understand the mechanism, behind that.
So that's a good segue. So I'm curious, and I've like 10 different branches of questions, but I'm just gonna have to pick one. So you often, there are those that roll their eyes at anything that isn't mainstream, like give me a pill, that's science, right? Like pharmaceutical. And then there are those that are the complete opposite end of the spectrum, like no thank you, like all the way into sound healing, all the way into Reiki, all of these spiritual practices. I'm curious where you fit. I mean, it seems like you're perhaps a blending of the two, but everything you've talked about is completely scientific. There hasn't really been any woo. So is there kind of a spirituality, and or on the flip side, have you received any pushback from like mainstream science into what you're doing? And where does that fall? And what are the applications of the Cymascope in these realms for healing and all that?
Pushback? No, actually quite the opposite. 2 years ago, I was invited to write a chapter for a new medical textbook on sound therapy and music medicine. And I should also point out, by the way, that this term music medicine is now a new clinical term. So this is another indicator of the way that medicine is moving. Now, so how do we differentiate, for example, music medicine from music therapy? You probably have heard the term music therapy, because music therapy actually is mainstream. It's been around since the 80s, I would say, and it's still on the rise now. And So basically, a music therapist's job is to assist a patient in either the pre or post-operative stages of their hospitalization, to help them relax, because it's very well known that when the body enters into a parasympathetic state, that healing can occur much faster and more naturally. And so the whole idea of music is to cause the patient, to move into this, what's termed a parasympathetic nervous state, which is essentially a relaxed state, right? When you're relaxed, things can happen naturally in your body. When you're all tensed up, there are all sorts of chemicals flowing in your bloodstream that will actually prevent your healing. Like cortisol, for example, will flush throughout your bloodstream if you're in a kind of nervous state. Whereas the music therapist will help you to relax, and choosing beautiful music has other benefits that, we could talk about. But what's happened now in mainstream is this recognition that the music itself has biological benefits for the patient, regardless of the intervention of a therapist. So the therapist aspect is really a bit like a psychologist in a way. It's a talk therapy. They're talking literally on one-on-one with the patient. But now mainstream has recognized that it's still a very important role, and it will never go away, but they've also recognized now that the music itself has therapeutic benefits, even without the therapist. And this is very good news. Obviously, for one reason, is that there would never, ever be enough therapists to go around, right? There are millions of people in hospitals all over the world right now in hospital beds, but there's, a kind of relative handful of music therapists to go around. So this is very, very, very good news. Anyway, so there hasn't been any pushback. So getting back to what I've just been saying there, this new medical textbook is now available. It's a textbook of alternative therapies. That doesn't mean any woo-woo. These are all tried and tested therapies. And in my case, the chapter that I wrote was focused entirely on sound and music. So sound therapy. Some people call that sound healing. I don't like the term sound healing. It's probably we're stuck with it. It's like one of those many words that we end up being stuck with, like sound wave, we'll never overcome that. But sound healing, sound therapy, it means the same thing. It's basically the use of sound to catalyze healing in the body. And those sounds can come from very wide variety of instruments. They can come from Tibetan bowls, crystal bowls, didgeridoo, many different types of traditional and new style instruments, but can also come from single frequencies that are now being emitted from specific therapeutic instruments that have been designed, for therapeutic use. And also, of course, from music. Music has a very wide frequency array, bandwidth. So all of these different ways. And so this whole chapter, this whole medical textbook is focused on these alternative therapies. And all I've had actually so far from clinicians all over the world is a great deal of support. Having said that, it's not going to be a quick fix change. Medical science in particular is very slow to change. I learned recently from a colleague that there's actually a 17-year gap between discovery and actual practice. The discovery of a new medical fact that's going to help potentially millions of people, and that new fact become part of some new therapy, some new intervention clinically. 17 years, can you believe it? So it's a very slow process, and maybe it's right to be slow. But anyway, it is happening. That snowball will continue to gather. When it comes to, you mentioned the Cymascope instrument, it's been helpful in so many ways. One way in particular that I'm really excited to share with you and everyone watching and listening is a discovery made in 2018 with Professor Sungchul Ji of Rutgers University. He's now emeritus, but he's still a professor, but he's emeritus now. But in 2018, he came to my lab here, and we worked together on designing a protocol to see whether music would assist red blood cells in their longevity, whether the interaction between music and the blood would actually cause the blood cells to live longer. And it was just a hunch that I'd had many years ago. And anyway, Professor G came here to help me to design the protocol, and we worked for several days. The experiment I'd like to describe now is a kind of, well, it was an amazing moment in my life, a bit like the pyramid moment, but completely different. So what happened was we'd been working with little vials of blood in the incubator here in the lab, and we also had a control vial in the lab's Faraday cage, which is a very, very quiet control environment, extremely quiet, almost as quiet as an anechoic chamber. So that's the control. And then the vial of blood that's being exposed to music in the incubator in the lab here has a little speaker in there, so we can actually play music to the blood. And the other vial is in, as I say, in a quiet environment. And then we do a test. We're literally using an automatic blood cell meter counter device, and we're testing how many red blood cells are viable in the control and how many red blood cells are viable in the music blood. Bearing in mind, it's the same blood, we just decanted it into two different vials, right? So, and the results were astonishing. Immediately, we were seeing significant, like 15, 20% increase in the viability of the red blood cells. But we then had to kind of scratch our heads and figure out, well, what's driving this mechanism? What could it be? Well, the clue came from the fact that we had tested classical music, some selections of classical music, but then we also did some experiments with pop music. And it turned out, very counterintuitively, that the classical music was quite poor in its return percentages compared with the pop music. The pop music outshone the classical music every time. And this is really bizarre, isn't it? You've probably heard of that experiment where somebody played pop music to a plant and it wilted, rock music, I think it wilted. But then when they played classical music, the plant bloomed. I don't know how much truth there is in that. I suspect that one of the factors in that experiment, if it really did happen, because it's kind of legendary, isn't it? I've never found out who it was that said that or conducted that experiment, but I'm suspecting that they really turned up the welly, the volume of the rock music to dangerous levels, basically. So the poor plant, of course, like anyone, would be affected negatively by that. Whereas if you play classical music at a modest level, then of course the plant would like it, So that may be the underlying, reason for the plant wilting. But in this case, it was the exact opposite. We were controlling the sound level very carefully to 80 to 85 dBA. And so basically the blood was responding way better to popular music than it was to the classical music. And it turned out that the reason for this, cutting a long story short again, is the low frequency, throbbing, pulsing, driving bass beat of popular music. That is the healing, right? And in classical music, it's beautiful, of course, to the ear, but it has very little low frequency register. It's kind of mainly mid-range and upper frequencies in classical music. I mean, of course, there are some pieces like Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, with the cannons and everything, but mostly classical music is quite low on the bass energy. Anyway, that was the reason that we hypothesized at the time. And since then, we have conducted a lot more experiments. And in recent times, just finished recently, actually, a few weeks ago, a very major study, not only with red blood cells, but also with white blood cells, and also measuring the oxygen in the blood. And this is the reason now I'm telling you why I got so excited that day with Professor G in 2018, and he was super excited as well. So having hypothesized that it was the low frequencies in the music that was driving this healing mechanism, whatever it was, we then thought, right, okay, well, the little speaker that we're using in the incubator has quite a poor bass response relatively. It's like the lowest frequency it could manage was about 80 hertz. So we thought, well, what if we could give the blood even lower frequencies? Would that make a further improvement in the viability of the red blood cells? So what we did was to inject some blood literally into this instrument, into the Cymascope instrument. Why? Because it has a frequency response that can go way down to 3 hertz, right? So what happened was this. We injected the blood into the Cymascope, and we played a 44 hertz tone into the blood. This is obviously a lot lower than the 80 hertz, that was possible from the music speaker. And what happened was a beautiful pattern emerged, imprinted on the surface of the blood. This is a first in history, never been achieved before. Nobody probably ever thought about doing it. So there was this beautiful pattern, just as what we would expect, a hexagonal pattern actually, as it was. And that in itself wasn't a surprise. Why? Well, any sound will always imprint onto a water membrane. In this case, blood is mostly water, actually. And so that wasn't a surprise. But then I brought the slider down on the audio mixer that was sitting beside the instrument, and the pattern remained imprinted on the blood, right? And we were like, what? So let me just explain what this means and what this infers. First of all, when we receive the blood from a blood bank, it's very, very dark red. It's kind of like a dark maroon color. But also you have to know that blood that we receive from the blood bank is engorged with oxygen. So the person, whoever it was, the donor that gave that blood, was, of course, breathing, right? They're alive, they're breathing. And so that oxygen immediately goes through from the lungs, through the alveoli in the lungs, into the bloodstream. And then when the blood is taken from the person, from the donor, it's still engorged with oxygen. But turns out that oxygen is not available to the hemoglobin molecules in the red blood cells. Why? Because it's quiescent. The blood is quiescent. It's just, there's no pressure in that blood. The pressure in the human body for this absorption of oxygen by the hemoglobin comes from the heartbeat. Every time there's a heart pulse, that's actually a pulse of low-frequency sound. And it's the sound, that low-frequency pressure of sound, that causes the binding of the oxygen to the hemoglobin. So what was happening in the Cymascope was we were putting in this low-frequency sound, 44 hertz, pretty low frequency actually, created this beautiful pattern, caused the oxygen in the blood to bind to the hemoglobin, but only in the parts of the pattern, the cymatic pattern, where there's what's termed antinodes. These are the areas of highest pressure in the sound. And so in those areas of high pressure in the pattern, this dark maroon-colored blood becomes bright scarlet, right, against the background of the nodal parts of the pattern, which are still maroon. So now you have this beautiful imprint literally sitting there in the blood, My goodness, what a moment that was, in my life and in Professor G's. And so from that, we've gone on to do, some other very important work in relation to what we've now discovered, which is that oxygen is the key molecule in the body for healing. And one of the many reasons for music being so healing, and sound frequencies in general being so healing, is that when they impinge, when they literally penetrate into your body, well, there's a number of mechanisms going on, but one of them is to increase the oxygen binding. So the oxygen that the person is breathing and going into their bloodstream is now increased. So the percentage will rise and therefore deliver just another maybe 1 or 2% of oxygen to their whole body. And almost every mechanism in the body that relates to healing is powered by oxygen. So even just a 1 or 2% increase in oxygen causes fabulous results in the body in terms of additional healing. That's one of the many mechanisms. Another one relates to what I said earlier about cymatic patterns imprinting on membranes in general all around us, but not only all around us, inside of us. So we have interstitial, we have visceral waters in our body, but we also have membranes around every cell of our body. And what happens when music or other sound frequencies penetrate into our body, then beautiful cymatic patterns literally imprint around the cellular membranes. And one of the aspects of illness that can occur, it relates to something called the Giza phase of the cell cycle. And what this means is that cells go into a kind of sleep state when they are challenged by, say, an invasion of a pathogen, or we've imbibed some toxic substance or whatever. A certain system of the body will literally go to sleep. So these cells in this system, whatever it is, are not functioning in a normal way. They normally would go through replication cycles, mitosis, and so on. But no, in this case, they're asleep, right? And if you look at the medical literature for the Giza phase of the cell cycle, it will tell you that to stimulate the cells to come back online, rejoin the cell cycle, one of the ways that you can achieve that is with nutrition. Another way is just with sheer time. Medical doctors often say, you need a good rest. Well, of course, there's a heck of a lot of, wisdom in that statement. But in this case, I'm referring to sound frequencies as a form of nutrition. Now, that might sound like woo-woo, but I'd like to now just step back to 2002 when Professor James Jimzewski at UCLA made an amazing discovery, which is that every cell in your body sings a song. Well, he called it poetically a song. It's not really a song, but it's an array of frequencies, right? And they're complex. It's not a single frequency. It's quite a complex array of frequencies. So now thinking about what I've just said in the Giza phase of the cell cycle, when music enters into your body or sound frequencies enter into your body and create this beautiful cymatic pattern around the membrane of the cell, what you need to know now is that in a normal cell, the cell is respirating, the actual cell membrane is moving and creating sound. But these cells that we're talking about now are in a sleep state, so they're not making any sound, but they have little, what's termed integral membrane proteins that project from the cell membrane, right? These are like little antennae. It's the way that the cell communicates with its brother and sister cells. It's the way that the cell takes in nutrients and excretes waste products and so on. But these little antennae, when this cymatic pattern emerges around the cell membrane, one of the things you have to realize about music is that it's changing all of the time. There are phase changes happening. So the cymatic pattern is not static. It's rotating, gently rotating. As the music changes, so the pattern is rotating about the cell membrane. And now you get the picture that these little IMPs projecting from the cell membrane are getting a beautiful massage, right? And they're absorbing the acoustic energy, literally their own song. This is literally what's happening. The cells are excited by receiving energies that relate to their own song, and that causes them to reawaken. I liken it to the Sleeping Beauty story, with the prince and the princess. He kisses the princess and she awakens. It's a little bit like that, how I think of it anyway, that this beautiful music causes, or sound frequencies causing these cells to rejoin the cell cycle. There are many other biological mechanisms at work, but there's just a couple of them to show that this is not woo-woo. This really is, good solid science.
Yeah. Interesting. It makes me think of, when people say that their vibe is off, where like you can experience people's energy, as people say. Would you have a hunch that those two things might be related, right? If your cells are singing a song and your consciousness is connected to your cells, right? And they're all, if your vibe is off or your cell singing that song, right? Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. However, I don't think it's the same mechanism that we're referring to here. More than likely, it's not anyway. This is a very complex area that you're now talking about, and there's not a lot known about it. But I'm going to just share a couple of facts about this that will, I'm sure, interest you and everyone watching and listening. And that is that, well, let's start with the heart itself. The heart, as we mentioned, it's got many functions, actually. The primary one, of course, is as a pump. But the heart and the brain, they are communicating with each other all of the time. This is not just pure electrical signals or anything relating to simply keeping the heart going. The heart's got its own pacemaker, you could say, built in. No, there's a whole other set of information going on between the heart and the brain. And it was actually the Heart Math Institute in the US who said that the energy leaving the heart, the electromagnetic energy leaving the heart, because the heart's actually quite a powerful electromagnetic source, that energy contains a huge amount of data, right? When this is a fact, right, it does indeed contain a huge amount of data. So if you take an ECG, an electrocardiogram of your heart, then of course you will see the typical waveform, and I'm coming back to that term wave now, when it is a wave in this case because it's literally the graph of the energy of the heart. You'll see that on the back, if you like, of that waveform, there's a whole another realm of data that nobody is bothering to look at the moment, right? And this is the energy of the heart. So coming to your question now, someone's vibe, right? Almost certainly we are, as humans, we sense a person's energy as we approach them. As we get within, 20 feet or so, according to heart math, using squid magnetometers and so on, they can literally sense the electromagnetic energy from a heart, like several feet away, up to 20 feet away or several meters. And so we now get the picture that as we approach someone, we are the instrument. Our whole body is the instrument that is picking up on that person's heart field, and some part of us that we don't yet understand, because it's obviously something that's just an area that's never been discovered yet, but some part of us actually senses the energy of that person. And again, this is not woo-woo. This is, scientific. We're talking about electromagnetism that has data in it. So the person, whatever that person is thinking, when you have a thought, right, that thought begins a process of, first of all, it's a biochemical process in the neurons of the brain, but also there are various other aspects to that thought. Those biochemical reactions create sound in the brain. They also, so this is biological noise, it would be classified in neuroscience, I guess, but it's actually still got a lot of data in it. The sounds that are created in those biochemical processes then create infrared light. Why? Because the collisions, these atomic collisions in the sound, literally cause light to be created. And this infrared light now contains a huge amount of data. And then these signals also, the sound signals also create, through the piezoelectric effect, electrical signals. And of course, it's the electrical signals that then travel to the heart. And the heart, then you could liken it to an amplifier. So the signals in the brain electrically are very low level, as you probably know, they're extremely low level. But when these signals, when these thoughts that we're having that are then become electricity that travels to the heart becomes an amplifier, just like plugging in, a microphone to an amplifier, and suddenly you've got much higher sound level than we had, without that microphone. It's a similar sort of situation. So what I'm believing, from the heart math model, if you like, is that every thought we have is literally leaving our heart and going out into the world through the electromagnetic energy of the heart. Well, if that's true, and of course this needs to be proven, that's a hypothesis, by the way, right? But if it's true, then no wonder you can sense someone's vibe, because you're literally picking up on their very thoughts or some deep part of us is picking up on their thoughts. And so someone that's smiling at you, but really they've got malicious intent, for example,
Right.
some part of you knows that smile is not right, And so this is, I believe anyway, how almost certainly we're sensing the vibrations of that other person, almost certainly purely from the heart energy, which is quite a powerful electromagnetic energy.
So that goes back to this pulsing of the heart linking to the consciousness, right? So you have this consciousness engine and then this vibration engine. Is that
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was great, and thank you so much. Like, so interesting. And if you'd like,
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas, because my whole point of being a scientist is to share what I'm learning with the world, basically. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
absolutely, and thank you, and we'll get it out there. I think in closing, the most important question: what is Blood's favorite music? Does this explain Taylor Swift? Is the question. When you're testing the effects of these different types of music on Blood, you said pop music. Is there an artist? Do different people's bloods have different favorite bands, things like that?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I do like Taylor Swift's music, by the way. In fact, got a very broad taste in music. We listen to a lot of classical music in our home here, but we also listen to a lot of different artists, pop music artists. But to answer your question, really all comes back to this base energy that we haven't found any genre of music that the blood prefers to any other. It all comes back to the level of base energy. The more base energy in the music, provided, and this is always the caveat here, is that the quality of the music has to be harmonic. It cannot be dissonant or distorted. So if the reproduction means of the music, in other words, the amplifier, the speaker, if the speaker is being overdriven, so you end up with a distorted sound, that is very bad for the blood, and we have been able to prove that. The blood does not like distorted music. As long as the music is clean, so not distorted. And also the other very important factor in this is the sound pressure level. What we found is between 70, for those people who understand these units, between 70 and 85 decibels, dBA, is the kind of Goldilocks zone for healing. If it's below 70, what we found is that there's very little response in the blood. Playing music very quietly, it can have other effects on us, of course, because we can still hear it very nicely, even at 65 dBA. And if we're hearing beautiful music at 65, then of course it will give us other benefits because we love the music. Say, when we love music, it causes dopamine to be created in the body. And there's then a lot of science showing a correlation between dopamine levels in the body and the immune response. The white blood cells are proliferated when there's higher levels of dopamine, right? So that's still happening. But the other mechanism that we're referring to, where oxygen, the amount of oxygen drives, many healing processes in the body, that will only occur if the sound level is 70 decibels and above. 65, you won't get much of a healing effect. So it's got to be between 70 and 85. If you go to 90 decibels and higher, then you're starting to stress the red blood cells and indeed the white blood cells. And so, again, this is not a good thing to be doing, right? So if you go to a rock concert, for example, which would be very beneficial in general health terms, provided your body is not going to experience sound above 85 decibels. And those huge racks of speakers, of course, and massive amplification can put out extremely high sound pressure levels. But, these days, almost everyone has a smartphone of some kind. And you can download sound pressure, sound level apps, some of them are free. So you can take that around with you, carry that around when you go to a concert, for example, and just make sure that you're not receiving sound above 85 decibels. And if you are at a concert and you're receiving more, just go farther back from the speakers, right, until you don't receive such high sound pressure levels. Because it's not only going to damage your hearing, it's going to literally damage your health as well in the longer term. And so, but then another experiment that Professor G and I did was with blood at 110 decibels. And what happened then was really interesting. It literally killed all of the red blood cells stone dead within 20 minutes. Wow. So there was no red blood cells left in that blood alive after 110 decibels. So this is, one of the reasons why there is legislation relating to sound pressure levels for people, particularly at work. If you're in an environment, it's not only the sound pressure level in a moment that is important. It's how long are you exposed to it. We can all take a bit of abuse in our bodies, of all sorts of kinds of abuse the body will bounce back from, but not if it's for too long a period. And so this is why legislation, covers people at work in terms of the sound levels that they're exposed to. Anyway, so it was really interesting to find that Goldilocks zone of 70 to 85 for the optimal healing effect, and then to learn that below that, very little healing, and then above that actually causes real harm to the red blood cells. So that was a really interesting experiment. It's been a great chat. And I'd like to come back, if I may, and share a lot of other interesting information.
Yeah, for sure. Please do. And I can tell you, I'm definitely going to be the guy at the next concert I go to using my phone like a metal detector, trying to find that.
The healing zone. Yeah, right.
Thank you again so much. We will absolutely keep in touch and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the School of Imperfection podcast. If you are interested in exploring these ideas and more with us, don't forget to follow and subscribe to catch every future episode. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to leave us a rating or send us an email to share your thoughts through www.theschoolofimperfection.com. We're always looking for more guests as well. So if you feel like you have an interesting perspective or a topic our podcast has not covered or has, we'd love to connect with you. I'm your host, Mikey Crystal. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.